Te Koto Te Whānau, o Auckland Unitarians. Te Koto Ngā Manahiri. No mai, hire mai ki tēnei hui. Te Koto tēnā tātou katoa. Sometimes you may feel like a motherless child. Here may you find a warm greeting, a kind word, a gentle touch. Sometimes you may feel like you have no friends. Here may you find a community of support, a pulse of liberation, a vision of hope. Sometimes you may feel you are almost gone. Here may you find a song to sing, a moment of silence, a hand to hold, even when you are a long way from home. May just seeing each other's faces give you may this Zoom community break through your loneliness, and may you feel the embrace of a larger spirit of life and love. Come, let us worship together. We kindle a flame of power, illuminating the holy in each of our faces. We recognize in the flame a passionate commitment to our shared faith. We are held and carried from day to day, week to week, in the shining of the light. This flame is mine as well as yours. We are brought together on this day, called to growth, to expansion within its glow. What does your heart know while beholding this holy fire? A reflection by Jay Abernathy entitled "We Can Never Know." How can we begin to understand what hope and healing means in the face of a deadly illness with no cure? We have many sources of hope and healing in our lives: singing, praying, thinking, communicating, acting, giving, and remembering. Dr. Richard Cavett tells the story of a young theological student in clinical pastoral education who was encountering for the first time in his life a patient whose illness was so severe that the doctors told the student that this woman had slim chance of survival. The woman asked the young man to pray for her, and in this first encounter with such a request, the student minister was overwhelmed with feelings of inadequacy and despair. He turned away from the bedside and buried his face in his hands, fought back tears, and tried to regain control of his emotions. Finally, he got himself together and stood up. Embarrassed and ashamed, he took the woman's hand, offered a simple blessing and goodbye, and fled from the room. Much to the surprise of the clinicians, the woman underwent an unexpected recovery when Dr. Cabot was talking with her later about how she was able to rally and respond so well. She replied, "I think it all began with that young theological student who was so intense in his prayers for me." I've entitled my random musings today as Dead People's Goals. This week I've been musing on suffering. Cheery stuff, I know. The problem is these days it is pretty hard to avoid. We're all aware of the incomprehensible number of heartaches involved. Suffering is a boat we all share. So, yes, I think I can be forgiven for musing on suffering. In my line of work, such musings lead me naturally to religious thought about the subject, for all religions have something to say. But I resonate with Buddha's teachings most. He acknowledged, all I teach is suffering and the end of suffering. Suffering in his teaching does not necessarily mean only grave physical pain, but rather the mental suffering we undergo when our tendency to hold on to pleasure encounters the fleeting nature of life and our experiences become unsatisfying and ungovernable. But before I could begin fully laying out for you Buddha's take on suffering, I listened to Derek Hanley's conversation with Dr. Susan David, who is a psychologist on the Harvard Medical School faculty. I hope you have got to know Derek, one of our newer members and a worship associate. And I recently found out a wannabe astronaut. In fact, next week, he will be our muser, so I hope I'm not stealing his thunder. Susan David has become well known for her TED Talks and her best-selling book, Emotional Agility. What I took from the conversation is our suffering is a source of data about who we are and to what we are attached. But we live at a time of hyperpositivity, which she deems to be an artificial enabler of false happiness. Perhaps she's a Monty Python fan. The end of the life of Brian makes her point brilliantly. I dare you to try and get that tune out of your head the rest of the day. As an anecdote to false happiness, Susan asks 3 questions. What happens when we pretend to be happy when we are not? What happens when we pretend we don't hurt when we are dying inside? What happens when we say we're okay, but our current version of okay is no one's dream of the new normal? What happens is we end up pretending to live as only a dead person can. No pain, no anguish, no challenges. As Susan sums it up, only dead people never get unwanted feelings or inconvenienced by those feelings. Her conversation with Derek about dead people's goals triggered a significant life-altering memory for me. I was in my mid-40s and I was in extreme emotional and spiritual pain. So much so, I overcame my strong reluctance to do so and sought out a therapist. The first couple of sessions were pleasant enough. I kept the conversation on a safe intellectual level, far away from feelings. I'm sure the therapist was used to men using this strategy, but it must have been frustrating all the same. Their vocation is not to be pleasant conversationalists. So the third session, he suggested we do some role playing. I hope I didn't visibly roll my eyes as I groaned internally, but not wanting to be judged uncooperative, I said with as much false positivity as I could muster, sure, why not? He suggested that I be my younger self, explaining to my present day self what life was like. Without much thought, I seized on how difficult it had been for me moving so much. It seemed like every time I turned around, I was going to a new school. My newness stood out. As much as I tried to stay hidden, I wore a lot of beige to be invisible because when spotted, I was often bullied, sometimes even by my teachers and coaches. The only place I felt safe was at home, but that is where I felt most conflicted. My fear was the bullies were right about me being a loser, worthy only of disdain. I certainly didn't want that revealed to my parents, who might not have noticed this about me before. So I suffered in silence and every morning went off to school for another day of abuse, trying to convince myself I could endure it. And to some degree I did, but at a price. My older self was very judgmental about my younger self. He had bought into the bully's view of who I was and swore he would not be so weak and vulnerable again. He convinced himself he could endure anything, even an abusive partner. He only had to look at the bright side of life. Of course, he couldn't, which is what brought him to the therapist in the first place. The turning point was when, with a few well-placed questions from the therapist, I saw my younger self in a new light. Instead of weak, I experienced his vulnerability as bravery and courage in the face of adversity. Yes, his survival strategy is what you might expect of a child. And yes, it had created some problems for my older self, but he did survive so I could become an adult capable of choosing healthier strategies that did not require denial of my suffering or convincing myself I could endure anything alone. I remember becoming totally immersed in the role play. It ended with tears and me embracing my younger self with admiration and gratitude, as well as forgiveness. It was a moment that made me appreciate Buddha's wisdom. Unless we're dead, we suffer. Or to counter Descartes' head trip, I suffer, therefore I am. It is what we do with it that matters. It is human nature to seek permanence and stability. It attaches us to a false reality. All is transient and impermanent. Even the Buddha dies. His final words were, impermanence is inescapable. Everything vanishes. Therefore, there's nothing more important than continuing the path with diligence. All other options either deny or short shrift the problem. At some level, we know this. But that does not stop us from trying to convince ourselves that if we just fix this or fix that, tweak here or there, we can avoid it. We think if we were smarter, prettier, wealthier, more powerful, living somewhere else, younger, older, male, female, with different parents, you name it, things would be different. But things are not different. They are as bad as they seem. Since it is unrealistic to hope for a stress-free life, and that would not be all that good in any case, it makes more sense to learn how to deal with the stresses that inevitably arise. According to our friend Buddha, suffering is the result of our attachments. Yet even some of Buddhist monks revealed that they had not escaped their attachments, grieving deeply at his death. Attachments in themselves are not something negative. When we love someone, we are attached. When we care about justice, we are attached. When we strive to live healthier lives, we are attached. When an unexpected memory results in a tear drifting down our cheek, we are attached. When we are swept away by beauty, we are attached. When we seek connection with something greater than ourselves, we are attached. While ultimately, my attachments mean I will suffer, I would not give them up to avoid the pain. My suffering is a sign of my humanity. It is a sign that I am alive. And as we are all in the same boat, I need not endure it alone. Amen. For our breakout, I offer this for you to talk and think about. What are the attachments you're seeking to make permanent during this pandemic? And how is that working out for you? And now it's time to extinguish our virtual chalice. And we all know the words, so join me. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Moving along. For my closing words, I've selected some from Margaret Fuller. And if you haven't come to my history of UU classes, you may not know who she is. She was a close friend of Emerson's, who selected her to be editor of the Dial, which was a early journal of Unitarian thought, transcendentalist thought. And she was quite a remarkable woman, sadly died young in a shipwreck. But she was a journalist and editor and one of their earliest activists in America for women's rights. These are her words. Be revered in thee, the faithful hope that still looks forward and keeps the life spark warm of future action beneath the cloak of patient suffering.